Okay, cool. Welcome back to this workshop. Like I said, I am no subject matter expert, so take everything with a pinch of salt and please ask questions as much as possible, even during the workshop as well as during the end. Cool. Fundamentals then. Do you remember these three things? One, that no one is really great at debating finance. The reason why I say debating finance is because people can be great at knowing the subject. They know how it works. They know every sort of intricacy that you want to know about a finance motion or a economics motion. But not everyone can debate it the way they want to debate it, primarily because the second reason is that in most instances judges are not experts, which means that if you know something and you probably try to and make the judge understand the most complicated way possible, they probably are not going to understand it. So which means that everyone has to dumb things down because they have to make everyone in the room understand what they're talking about, which means that no one's really great at economics and debating economics in and of itself. And if you believe something that you cannot understand, it's also quite likely that judges also do not understand what the motion entails. So yeah, just two things you should remember always. So don't get jazzed out by complicated finance stuff that teams you end up talking about. If it's too complicated, probably judges can't understand either. And lastly, always try to think in the perspective of an average middle class citizen. The reason I say this is because this helps you get a perspective of what kind of arguments you can run, how it impacts your life. If you can use those impacts and or use those examples that you might face as a consequence of this motion, you can turn a lot of those into fully fledged arguments and think of just an analysis based on what your perspective of this particular motion will be. So yeah, place yourself in the perspective of an average middle class citizen, and you will be at least somewhat in the debate. Cool. Definition then for economics first. So I know economics and finance are two separate concepts, but I think this workshop just mixes it up a lot more because CABs don't make motions differently for economics and finance. It's mostly colloquial in a particular manner. So economics is a study of how people use limited resources to meet their needs and wants. This is a very bookish definition of what you might have read, similar to what you might have read like in your 10th, economics. There are three things that economics entails. One are needs, essential for survival, food, water, shelter. Your wants, things that make your life enjoyable, and scarcity, which means limited resources, means not everyone can have everything they want. If you notice, these three are also examples on what you can use in an economics or a finance debate. So obviously there are goods like medicine and education that would come under needs, right? Something that cannot be compromised. Things like even water and shelter, something that cannot be compromised. Wants are things that people usually end up buying, so things like stocks or other assets like FDs or real estate. Those are things that people can live without buying. So those are wants that make your life better, surely, but they are not something that you cannot live without. And scarcity, which means that the world or the earth itself has limited resources, and every positive for some person would automatically mean a negative for someone else. So if and this is also true cross applicable for all kind of motions about rights and movements as well, right? Because if minorities get more rights in terms of say getting quotas, then obviously majorities will the seat that quota is taken away from the seats the majority have, right? So everything works around a limited frame, which means that all positives are associated with an equally bad negative. And debates are just about that, right? Those trade-offs that you make, that why is that trade-off justified? So yeah, these are just like three framings also that you need to know on how to approach economics and finance motion beyond just the definition of what it means. Cool. Demand and supply. Now, again, this might look like a theory lecture, but the reason why I'm telling you this is also because a lot of the so-called mechs that you use in economics and finance debates can be derived out of these things. So yeah, this is the demand curve that the law of demand says as prices go up, demand usually goes down. So when things like inflation happen, you can use this as like as reason in one of your debates, right? That if inflation happens and prices go up, like it's just a cyclical process of how people now stop spending, and that brings the inflation down, or just it can increase it in the later go as people do the market confidence goes down as also a consequence, right? So similarly, if prices keep on increasing due to currency appreciation or just the like governmental policy, the demand usually will go down, and that means consumerism goes down. People live a worse kind of life because we tie back to what we discussed earlier, right? That you need money for a lot of these things, which is either needs or wants, and that means demand. As different prices go up, demand usually go down as a consequence. So again, an impact, but also a mechanism of how it works. So demand is basically the quantity of product that people are willing to buy at various prices. So you would notice for something like a need, which is like medicine or healthcare, or medicine, healthcare, even like food and shelter, food, water, shelter. For those things, the demand curve does not look the same because those are things that you cannot live without. So even if prices increase, people are still forced to buy these things at higher prices, considering these are needs that you want. But obviously, for things like for luxury items or things that you can choose to not opt into, like stocks or real estate, you will not end up buying those things if the prices go up. So this means that this law of demand is true for all items, most items, except the inelastic goods. These are goods for which the quantity demanded doesn't change even when a big change in price happens. So the emotions about pharma companies and all those things, you can derive a lot of the impacts you want out of this demand curve if you understand how this works. For anyone who does not know like the basics of economics, which I'll be surprised if you do not, but if you do not know, just like unmute at any point and ask me questions if you have any clarifications, right? I'm just going to reiterate what I said in the beginning. I'm just going to quickly brush over a couple of these concepts so we're on the same page when you get into the more complicated bits of debating. Cool. The opposite of demand curve is supply curve. The quantity of product that businesses are willing to sell at various prices. So this is from obviously on the business perspective or the side of or the supplier point of view as opposed to consumer point of view. The law of supply says that as prices go up, supplies usually go up because obviously our companies want to make profit. So the more prices increase, the more the companies have incentive to increase the kind of supply, considering they get more profit. But it works in correlation with the demand curve, right? Because those things don't exist in isolation. So if prices go up and supply also goes up, and demand is falling, then obviously there's a mismatch. And those things are where companies tend to do things like advertisement or subconscious messaging so that you keep on demanding things even if the prices are going up. You have multiple motions about these, about how companies want tax ad revenue and stuff like that. So those are things that you can also derive from how the supply curve works. All right. This is now the more complicated bit. The global economy. There are four parts to global economy primarily. The first is the government. Second are the banks. Third are the companies, and fourth are the consumers. All right. Now I've given like three circular flow within this workshop. If you're able to understand any one of those, that's great. You can choose, pick and choose which one you understand based on your level of understanding of economics in general. But this is the most primitive form of circular flow of economy, wherein individuals end up buying things from businesses, and businesses then give you goods and services because you have bought, or you give them money, right? So they give you goods and services. Similarly, businesses employ individuals, which means labor goes from individuals to businesses, and then businesses give income back. So there's a circular flow that happens between businesses and individuals specifically. So you would note here, and a lot of arguments can be brought into this, right? That if you increase the income that people have, the amount of money that people spend on buying goods and services also increases, which means expenditure also increases. But if you reduce the kind of income people have, this also reduces the expenditure that people do. So it's circular, right? Everything moves from one place to another. And this is just the most primitive understanding of how the circular flow economy works. I'm going to just give 10 seconds if someone has any questions before I get into the more complicated bit. Okay. Yeah, I was assuming there are no questions. Cool, let's get into the three-sector model then. So three-sector model is basically what I just explained, but in a more complicated way, right? There's an addition of the government structure within the three-sector model. There's still households and businesses. So if you notice, I've mentioned what goes from one sector to another. Labor and payments go from households to businesses, and businesses then, as a consequence of labor, they give you income. And as a consequence of you get buying stuff from them, they give you goods and services. So this is like just an explanation of what we discussed earlier. But if we add the government as a structure here, this is what it changes, right? That households pay taxes and labor to the government. And for taxes, you get services, and for the labor, you get income. Similarly to how, labor is basically exactly how people get employed within government structures or in private businesses. But the taxes is what changes here, right? That you pay taxes to the government and they give you services in the form of public welfare, policy making, healthcare, education, everything that you can talk about comes through those taxes. So taxes increase, government gets more money. That means they give you better services or just more services. Obviously, those things are within it, but this is the usual way it works out. Someone, okay, yeah, some textures OC, if you can let people in, cool. Businesses to governments, similar to how people pay taxes to governments, businesses also pay taxes in form of corporate taxes or wealth taxes to the government, and the government gives them services. The services can look like subsidies to businesses, but also helping them, set up, getting basic access to things like loans. A lot of government organizations give out loans to MSMEs, which are just starting out, and all those things. And yeah, the government also buys stuff from businesses. So governments also like have a licensing deal with a lot of private business owners, right? You have tender processes which they go through for, I don't know, military tech, even like regular things that road construction. So you might have seen a lot of L&T boards which build the DMRC metro. Those are private corporations hired by the government to build things for them. So governments also pay a lot of money to businesses to get services, and they then give the goods and services as a consequence. This is very always simple, right? But now here's where the kicker comes into this particular model. You mostly are going to have motions that target one aspect of these 6 arrows that you see. And you would notice that out of these 6 arrows, whichever part the motion targets, it has a ripple effect on everything else. So if you notice that if governments do get less money from, if governments reduce the amount of taxes they take from businesses, then the kind of services that they're going to give to other businesses reduces. So if government takes less money from the richer businesses, they do not have enough money to go ahead and give loans to smaller businesses. And that's an impact to draw out of it. Similarly, if the government has less money, then obviously that the kind of welfare schemes that they make for people reduces. So even if you target just the corporate tax, you still have a ripple effect to how the services are going to reduce to people, which means people spend more money to get their own healthcare because they cannot rely on government subsidies anymore. If that happens, the amount of money they have for buying goods reduces, which means the businesses also end up suffering. Even if they are paying less tax, the kind of sales they have also reduces because of the way the circular flow economy works, right? So government gets less money, people are forced to spend more money on these welfare services, which means they have less disposable income to buy goods and services from companies, which means companies' profits goes down, even if they are paying less tax to the government, right? So everything unlocks, even if you target any one part of it. Similar to how governments businesses should so there's obviously like a lot of motions about things like dumping, or should you allow production of or increase the amount of exports that you have from countries that can produce en masse, which is like countries like China, which produce like a lot of goods. So if you have a lot of goods that come in and people end up buying those goods, then obviously the amount of payments they make to other businesses also increases, which means governments can now increase the amount of taxes they get from people, from businesses, which means they can use that money to also give more services to people. So everything unlocks if you are able to target any specific part of this debate. Honestly, any motion that you see which talks about the kind of uh, yeah, honestly, emotionally say that which targets any kind of like taxes, income of people, the amount of labor that's employed, um, the kind of goods and services, import and export. All those motions can be unlocked on any sort of these stakeholders, and you can impact the motion on any of these stakeholders as a consequence. Obviously, this households becomes the most important or critical stakeholder because it's the easiest to weigh, right? Maximum number of people are people who end up relying on businesses and governments to get with their daily lives. But it's also like the most vulnerable population. So households are also have multiple classes within them. Similar to how businesses have multiple classes within them, you have the top tier businessmen, people or like big companies which are too big to fail, but you also have a lot of small scale companies, a lot of mom and pop shops that rely on government subsidies. Similarly, households, right? Like it's like there are people of richer classes who can still afford to buy things even if they get more expensive, and who are like paying more taxes. They're also the most vulnerable section of society who do not get access to these things and are probably reliant on things like government expenditure, government like welfare schemes or government services, right? So you can impact or bifurcate a lot of these parts, but the essential idea remains the same. That impact on one unlocks an impact on the other two. Think of any motion that you can find on any of these ideas, and you will be able to track based on this model on how it flows. I hope this is clear. No issues here. Okay, cool. Right. So households are consumers who demand goods and services. Businesses are suppliers who produce those goods and services. Governments are the ones that regulate and influence the economy with taxes, spending, and policies. So you will notice that things like austerity measures, right? So when governments increase the amount of taxes they collect from people, if that increases in the ability for businesses to reduce, ability for businesses to hire people reduces, which means lesser people get employed. So like I explained earlier, this is the same thing, right? When governments increase taxes, then businesses suffer, which means businesses cannot hire more people, which means unemployment is going to just increase as a consequence. When that happens, people are able to buy less, which means government expenditure also increases on individuals because they're not getting income from businesses, right? So they have to rely on government subsidies for things like healthcare and education. So, like I said, a cyclical flow of impacts flows irrespective of where you place any sort of debate. So austerity measures, I just explained how that works out. What happens when prices increase during inflation? When prices increase, people can buy less, which means businesses sell less, which means businesses cannot pay as much tax to the government, which also means that the kind of services that they give out to people gets impacted because government does not have a lot of money through taxes. So everything is interlinked, and you should be able to impact these things now after you've understood how this model works out. Are there any questions on this? Okay. I'm assuming none. Let's get into the four sector model. All right. So this is the most complicated one out of the sector models. If you think about it, if you have understood till the third sector model, it's three sector model. It's completely fine, and this is all you will need in most debates that you do. But obviously, there are things beyond the three sector model, right? There's obviously the financial market that comes into the picture. There's obviously things like foreign remittances. There is the larger global economy that you still have to play a part in. It's obviously not everything's not just localized. So if you notice here, a lot of things that you will see in more finance spec debates as opposed to economic spec debates gets like mentioned here, right? So you look at things like factor payments, which is borrowing and saving from bank accounts. So people also invest in things like financial markets because they put money in banks. You have a savings account, you have FDs, those things grow. But also you take money from banks as households in terms of loans for education or businesses or just starting up a business or like for anything like a loan for a car. Those things also matter, similar to how firms also invest in financial markets. They buy they buy into things like IPOs or they invest in stock markets. But they also take out a lot of loan from those banks and those financial markets to run their business and run their firms. So those things also are mentioned here. Similarly, how people have to now pay tax to the government as a consequence of the kind of money they earn from these savings. So and that then you look at the four sector model, right? The last idea on foreign sector as a whole. So you have foreign remittances that go from households to the foreign sector, but also they come from the foreign sector to households when you have people living outside. So things like diaspora, when they live outside, they also send a lot of money back and stuff like that happens. Similarly, export and import commodities, import payments are from the foreign sector to the firms. Similarly, firms give export commodities to they basically export goods outside the country. So it goes to the foreign sector. I'm going to send this slide so you can study this a lot more in detail. But like I explained earlier, the principle remains same. Is that unlocking an impact on one of those is largely going to cause a ripple effect. It might not always take into account the level of like impact it has on every sector is not going to be symmetric. Obviously, there's going to be more impact on certain individuals, certain kinds of players in the market more than others, but it will surely have some level of impact on every one of those sectors. So this is especially true for like BPs, right? So when you are in closing and the top half runs the obvious case on say what happens to households, there are obviously other ways to think about those kind of motions in terms of extensions, which means that if you know how this works out and how this also impacts other actors, like maybe the government or the financial market or how banks function or how your import export gets harmed, You can talk about those things and still have a chance to win the debate, even if you believe that the top half has burnt you on the most important stakeholder, which is households generally. So you can use a lot of these kind of back and forth, or this flow of money to unlock those kind of arguments, but also impact multiple other stakeholders. Like I said, I'll send this to you, and you can just read about this a lot more in detail. But just note that every finance, every eco motion will unlock an impact on all of them. So don't just restrict yourself to just saying that it's households that we care about. Sure, but there are other things also that matter equally. And this it's possible to actually explain why those other things sometimes do end up mattering more than say households as well, even if households are the maximum in number or the most vulnerable in number, most vulnerable in gravity. Sorry. All right. Are there any questions on this which are pressing or something that you are not immediately clear on? Okay. Right. Yes, Priyansh, go ahead.
I was confused between what is happening between foreign and household, like foreign remittances and manpower. How is it interconnected?
Yeah, so households send people to the foreign sector. This looks like brain drain. That people move out of the country to look for new opportunities. When they move out and they start living in those countries, they send a lot of money back home. Specifically, those people which like the entire family is reliant on, right? So a younger generation moves out, they go out and they stay in like say Western countries. They send money back. Those are foreign remittances, basically. Okay, cool. Now how money works. So yeah, that's the definition of money. This allows people to buy and sell goods and services and store of value. It just holds value over time, so you can save it. Okay, this was a little bookish definition. How do banks create money? Again, something that you should have probably learned or read about someplace in your school. That you have things like deposits that people make in bank accounts, and those that money that you deposit is utilized by the bank to create. They keep a portion of it because they have to, as per central bank guidelines. So these are your CRRs and your SLRs. You keep some portion of it, and you give the rest out to other people to as loans, and those other people then pay interest on those loans. That's how the bank makes money. But the more money they have, the more kind of savings they have, the more they have the ability to give out these loans. That's simply how it works out, right? So why do more people getting loans is good? It increases accessibility of money. People utilize the money for everything from education to business to healthcare. So the more people save their money in bank accounts, the more banks have ability to give out these loans. But if people are taking more loans, then obviously banks are in a crunch where they have to also deal with how people would want to take their money out at some point, maybe when things like crisis happens. And that's where you unlock a concept called bank runs, where in a crisis everyone wants to take their money out because they don't trust the bank enough. But the banks do not save or like keep all your money at the same time, which means that banks then face a crunch of money, which means the loaning process also reduces as a consequence. In times of crisis, when actually loaning should increase, it decreases. So both things are equally likely, and that's how like this concept gets actually worked out in a debate. But generally, when it's not times of crisis, this is how the process works out. If you deposit 100 rupees, the bank keeps 10 rupees as reserve ratios because they have to. They sell a loan of the 90 rupees to someone else. The person pays like say a 10% interest on it. You get 9 rupees on the 90 rupees, and that's how it keeps on working out. All right, loans then. A very used concept in debates. A loan is something that's borrowed with an agreement to pay it back later, usually with interest. The requirements for the loan are twofold. There's one, collateral, something valuable the bank can take if the loan isn't repaid. So this can look like your car, your some jewelry, the piece of land that you own. All those things can be collateral, and that you also have to show income proof to show that you can repay the loan. So the obvious question, some people ask me is that what happens when you don't have a collateral and poor people cannot get access to loans because they don't have collateral. The I think it's a very commonly used idea in debates, but for poor people, usually don't look at collateral, and this is especially true for those banks that target rural people, right? Specifically, or give out loans to poor people as a consequence. Those banks usually look at things that are different from collateral. So they look at how does the ability of an individual, what is the ability of an individual to pay things like, or pay the bills of things like utilities. So obviously even poor people utilize things like water, electricity to an extent, right? So what is their capacity or their previous track record of paying for the utilities, or the default on those kind of payments? So they don't always look for just collateral, they also look for other facets of what makes a person eligible, or why should you give them loans? Specifically, this is for poorer individuals. Secondly, they also look at things like group payments or group loaning. So what this means is that you don't just give loans to one individual, you rather give it to a group, right? Maybe like a self-help group, or maybe like a community, which is basically how like Amul works in Gujarat, right? So they are a cooperative, and the cooperative takes loans from the banks, and they still are able to get those loans, even if the individual people within those within that cooperative cannot have the same capacity to get that same amount of loan. But as a cooperative, they still get that higher amount of loan as a consequence of the bank just knowing that they are like, you can diversify the risk across these individuals. So if one person is not able to pay at some point, but the other person is still paying to an extent, so everyone earns something monthly, and they're just slowly steadily going to basically repay the entire loan back with interest. So you have things like group loaning, also you have things that are beyond collateral, and those are things that also banks do care about, especially like I said, smaller banks or banks that target rural areas specifically. So it's not just collateral. So when someone says that it's only the rich can afford loans, that's not necessarily true. It may be true that they can get the maximum amount of loans, but it's not like they are the only people who get loans, and there's literally no other way that you can get a loan beyond having a collateral. The interest rates are just the cost of borrowing. It's usually a percentage of the loan amount. Very bookish definition. It doesn't, I'm sure it doesn't help you if you know exactly what interest rates are. Are there any other doubts on this before I move forward? Okay, great. Some key concepts, and these are the concepts that I feel are used in debate motions the most. I think this is the more important section of the workshop. I think what you've just read, just heard previous to this is mostly just theoretical concepts that most of you are aware of. This is where the real, I don't know, the task begins on trying to explain, because not everyone gets exposed to these ideas in their school education. Okay, IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Yeah, IMF has a proportional voting system, which means the voting, or the amount of voting power you have is proportionate to the money you put into the IMF's like coffers, like, and the amount of money. And obviously those things impact the way IMF goes and gives out loans, or who they want to give out loans. So the US has an effective veto right now, because they pay 15% of the IMF's offer is basically given by the US or filled by the US. So they have the maximum amount of vote. UK, US, France, Germany, Japan together have a 40% share, which basically means the Western Bloc has an effective veto over what kind of countries do get IMF loans. So there are obviously some people who just like to run the idea that IMF is going to give you money. If not anything else, you can take a loan from IMF. But is the IMF going to give you a loan specifically of someone who is inclined towards like the non-Western bloc, right? So if you are someone who's like more pally with China or say Russia, you probably are not going to get an IMF loan even if you desperately want it, considering they get to decide what kind of policies that are supposed to be enforced on the person that you're loaning to, or what kind of person is loaned to, or what kind of country is loaned to. Those things are basically determined as a consequence of the voting power that these countries hold collectively. Secondly, IMF is, and I usually do not like people who just say that you can get a loan from IMF, because they are not like a free money institution. It's a for-profit institution, which means that they do expect you to pay your loans back. So if someone says that China is bad because China has predatory practices, China will take away your ports, but symmetrically it applies to IMF. Maybe it's somewhat better because it has like a democratic, like it has democratic participants like US or UK, but it doesn't mean that it's going to just give out the money to you and not expect you to repay it back. If you don't repay it back, they basically just enter your economy through the SAP, which I'm going to explain in a bit. But those things are equally pernicious, if not more than what China possibly offers as a deal. So it's not like a very clear-cut way to just debate that China bad, IMF good, because US, that's not how it works. It's a for-profit institution, and it also expects you to repay these loans back, and it's a lender usually of last resort. What this means is that IMF thoroughly checks whether you have no ability to ensure that you can revitalize the economy by yourself. before they go ahead and give out your loans. So there's a lot of checks and mechanisms that usually end up getting enforced. Like I said, it's not a free money institution. It's not a development aid NGO which gives free money to you. It basically does expect you to give it back, give the money back. Okay. So there are a few conditionalities that IMF has. One are austerity measures, which is that you must cut government spending, you increase taxation on individuals, you change the tax structure. IMF discourages any taxes on trade, but incentivizes taxes on consumption. So you should reduce tariffs, but what you should do is take more money from people when they are buying basic goods and services. This favors businesses much more because obviously it favors business interests since IMF mandates like the imposition of things like value-added tax or just some sort of tax regime that forces people to pay more for goods and services. So if tariffs reduce, then obviously trade increases, and that is just good for businesses as a whole. But who suffers at the end is the common people. So like go back to the first slide, right? Always think from the perspective of a common man and how it impacts your life. So even if you take loan from IMF, it's not going to be like all rose gold. Considering you have US, it can also be equally bad considering government isn't just increasing taxes and cutting spending on things like welfare policies. So those are things that IMF does impose on US conditionality. I'm just going to quickly go over SAPs before I get to, before I open the floor for some questions if you have any. The SAPs are structural adjustment programs that IMF forces countries to opt into when they give their loans. So these are just examples of what they usually do. So first thing that they do, and this is very common, is that they ask you to remove the protectionism from your economy, which means you can't specifically subsidize your domestic industry. You can't, be an isolated country. You have to get globalized. You have to allow things like FDI to enter your country, utilize your resources, use your manpower, and sell in the marketplaces, sell in those local marketplaces. So protectionism is something that's a big no-no for IMF. Secondly, you have to privatize the state-owned enterprises, so things like railways, electricity, utilities, water, even companies like insurance. All those companies that governments usually run as PSUs, you should privatize those so that private actors, like I said, should be able to come into the country. They generate revenues through sales and everything. Private entities that are usually not profitable, they shut down factories as a consequence. When that happens, they usually pull out from undeveloped regions first, as opposed to pulling out from developed regions. Because obviously, it's easier to shut down a factory wherein you get maybe things like lesser call out, or maybe when the kind of resources you put in are not as massive. So undeveloped regions usually end up suffering as a consequence of private entities usually shutting down factories that are not profitable. Thirdly, this looks like currency control getting lost from countries. So they tell you to weaken your rupees so that things like exports can increase, because obviously if you weaken your currency and you devalue your currency, exports just become cheaper and imports become much more expensive. So it makes you like an export driven economy. This is exactly what happened in Ivory Coast in the next example. So they focus on things like resource extraction, specifically if your country has like a good amount of resource on one thing or the other. So the comparative advantage that we usually mention in debates, right, that some countries have certain kinds of resources that they rely a lot on. For those countries, they force you to focus on that sector much more, because that's the best way you're able to make money, and that's the easiest way you'll be able to repay the loan back to them. Like I said, because it's a for-profit institution, so that's why they force you to focus on that sector the most, which means that the ability for you to diversify your economy reduces massively. So Ivory Coast is a classic example of how it was asked to increase its cocoa exports, which led to the loss of 2/3 of its forests. Basically like putting the economy in shambles and ruining the kind of topography of that particular economy as a consequence of them just focusing on one particular sector. So they did take a loan from IMF to like improve the economy, but ended up in a much worse off place as a consequence of the kind of SAPs that IMF forces countries to opt into. And lastly, it also talks about things like environmental regulations. So I would like I think it's obvious that some of these don't go with each other, right? So obviously, when you lose 2/3 of the forest, it's not in line with the environment regulations. But this is where IMF has to make a tricky trade-off. They might force you to exploit your environment much more and not impose things like environmental regulations on you. But if you are focusing on a sector like, say, tourism, for example, they'll enforce environmental regulations on you and ask you to go green, or like spend more in renewable energy resources, because those are things that also are expected out of you. Considering those things of the future, they usually end up costing less if you are able to produce them on scale. So again, economies of scale production of renewable energy just becomes cheaper than mining coal or petrol and stuff like that. So they still force you to opt into these things much more as a consequence of also just image pandering. If you notice that if IMF is run by UK, US, these are countries that usually say that we do not want to rely on things like coal and oil, and we want to have things like renewable energy resources. So those values do flow from the people who do the maximum amount of voting or hold the maximum amount of voting into the kind of countries they want to give the loans to. So that's the ideology also flows somehow, and that is something that IMF again forces countries to opt into. So this is how it usually works. They give out loans on conditions. Those conditions can be multiple things. Some are the austerity measures and changes to tax structure, but also protectionism, privatization of PSUs, loss of a currency control, and stuff like that. So those are things that IMF usually ask you to do in terms of giving you loans. Are there any questions on this before I get into the next bit? Yes, go ahead. Anyone, please.
So, for countries that are particularly prone to China's debt trap policy, do they really have any other option? Either they have China or they have IMF. Other than that,
no. There's no save us messiah that we have for those countries. They have to pick between the worst of the two evils, basically. Yes, Aditi.
So if we have to argue against like a country taking aid by IMF, but the context is that the country is facing some sort of economic crisis and the economy is pretty much dead. So what's like the kind of alternate make or argument that we could make then against, given the fact that the economy is already dead and you do need to have some sort of action to be taken?
Yeah, I would say that in debate land, everything can be proven. You can prove why a good alternative is China. So China gives you loans at very low interest. It doesn't force you to change the way your economy functions. All it takes is, as like in most instances, it takes a collateral out of you, and it says that just allow us to run our businesses in your country. That's the best thing to do. So even if they take some collateral, even if they take over one of your ports or some piece of your land, or maybe just take over a mine as they did in Congo, it's completely okay, because that's something that you can still like give away, because the economy at least gets revitalized. Okay, at least people are able to put food on the table. So those things do end up mattering to countries, which means that they don't have to change the entire topography, like I said, of the economy, and they can still get access to money by opting into China. Obviously, this sounds super counterintuitive. Why would you take a loan from China, China's debt trap policy, and all those kind of things? But in debate land, you can prove anything. Honestly, it is you should look at this activity not from the perspective of like actual real policy making. You're not in an MUN, like I said. You have to think about it from what is the most strategic for your case and how you should be able to win that round as a consequence of that strategy, and not rely on what is the real world. Sometimes you just have to lie in debates to win. I've always maintained that. Yeah, so those are possible ways you can go about explaining what the alternative is. Anyone else? Any question? Okay, we'll move ahead then. Yes. World Bank, similar. It does not have a proportional voting system, but World Bank is basically does similar kind of conditionality onto you. The differences are very minute. They usually work in tandem with each other. Similar to how like Asian development banks or the national development banks also work. So those are things which basically follow the similar kind of structure in the way they expect you to give money back. None of these entities are going to take collateral from you like China does. But what they usually do is they enforce policies. Now, what these policies are, something that you should read about much more in detail. But these are the policies that they usually encompass, which is that you should increase taxes, cut down government spending, no privatization. They work on similar models, but like the voting power is not the same. So I don't think World Bank has proportional voting system, but I'm not sure. I have to check this. All right, inflation. Again, a term thrown around a lot in debates. So when people have more money, they buy more goods. Then companies want to increase production. Go back to the supply. It's the law of supply. That when prices are increasing, companies just want to increase production. So they hire more people to produce those goods, which means they need more money to hire those people, which means they raise prices. That's how the flow of inflation usually works. And that's why at the end of the inflation, what you have is prices increasing massively and people not being able to afford, which means that it usually ends up self-correcting itself to an extent, but sometimes this leads to things like hyperinflation, something that I've also mentioned in one of the slides later, I hope. But this is the usual flow of how inflation works and how that leads to increase of prices specifically. Because people just say that inflation is bad because it increases prices, but how does it really gets visualized, something that you should know of. But inflation is not always a bad thing, because salaries can increase too, because obviously if you're increasing production and people are demanding more, which means companies are earning more, which means they hire more people, and when they hire more people, they give them higher salaries so that these people end up on board, getting onboarded and stuff like that. A small amount of inflation, like say 4 to 5% every year, can be good for the economy because it encourages people to spend and invest rather than hoarding money. Because obviously, if prices keep on increasing, the amount of money that you're hoarding or keeping with yourself, the value of that keeps on reducing as a consequence, right? So 20 rupees maybe in your parents' time is very different from 20 rupees right now. At that time, it could probably buy you, like, I don't know, a movie ticket, but right now it can't buy you a packet of chips. So those are that's happened because of inflation. So the way inflation works is that it also encourages people to invest the money into, or like use things for consumerism, as opposed to just keeping the money to yourself or putting it in bank accounts, because that doesn't help anyone. That just helps you, and maybe it helps you psychologically, but it doesn't really help you to grow your money or keep your money at least at the same value at par with inflation. So India also, I think, has like a 3 to 4% inflation rate, which is okay because it forces people to spend more, and consumerism is just then good for the entire economy, because it also helps businesses get more money, and that's why they hire more people, or they invest in things like R&D much more when they have more people buying goods from them, and they generate money through sales revenue that they have. So inflation is not always a bad thing. You should have some level of it. It should not go crazy, because then people just can't afford any goods and services, which means that no one's going to buy anything at all. FDI, which is foreign direct investment. When foreign companies set up factories and invest in an economy, it's called FDI. These companies produce goods in your country and often sell these goods in the domestic market. So the Apple plant in India sells iPhones to Indians. This is great because it also reduces the amount of it reduces the cost of these goods in a nutshell, because you are not reliant on things like imports from other countries. So if Apple builds makes manufactures phones in China, then obviously it's an import tariff that you have to pay if you buy it from China. If as a regular person you buy it from China, right? Or you place an order online, but it comes from China, and it like already factors in the tariff that it has to pay. But if it's built in India, it costs lesser, which means it's just good for consumerism. But FDI is also great because it creates things like jobs a lot, because foreign companies that come into your country usually end up targeting the value in human resource that you have, which means if you have a large scale population that is unemployed, then obviously a lot of them get employed, because domestic companies are probably not as big enough to hire all these people, which means foreign companies are required specifically. It's also happening like skill development of these people, because when foreign companies come in, they also bring a lot of technological innovations with them, which helps individuals learn new skills because of things like on-the-job training and stuff like that. So that's that. Then for FDI also ends up harming local companies. So if you have things like domestic companies, they usually get acquired, or they cannot compete at the same level as say a foreign company, as a consequence of foreign companies just having more power in terms of economies of scale, their methods of production, the kind of machines they use, but also things like marketing. They can't. So small companies, small budgets cannot compete with those big companies, and that's just bad for local development of businesses. So it's good also, but it's bad also, and it's up to the debaters to determine or explain why one thing matters more than the other. Short selling. Okay, so this is very interesting because I think this is a concept that not a lot of people understand, but people usually do, using this as, say, mech to explain why hedge funds or investment firms work in a particular manner. Short selling, in a nutshell, how it works is that you, as a person, you start with zero rupees, right? You start with nothing. You have nothing. You don't have a share. You don't have money. You go to like a person who is like the trader, and a broker, and you're the trader. You take, say, one share from this broker, right? And that one share costs rupees 100. You're not paid the money to the trader yet, or to the broker yet. You just utilize, or you just borrow the share from this person, and you sell it in the market. So it was not yours to sell, but you bought it and sold it anyway. And you earned 100 rupees as a consequence of selling that share. So now you have 100 rupees, something you started with zero, now you have 100 rupees. So the second thing is that you sell the share, right? Like you took ahead under 100 rupees, and then you wait for the price to drop. The way prices drop is something that obviously is a consequence of multiple things. It can be just because you have done good market research, or it can be because you have influenced the market in some way. So those things really are up to the debaters on how they want to explain why a price is going to drop. But that's like specifically when you use short selling in debating. But in the real world, it's mostly based on research that you believe a price is going to drop. So when the price drops to say 60, you end up going ahead and you buy the share back that you sold earlier at 60 rupees, right? Because that's the new market value. So when you buy it at 60 rupees, you give 60 rupees out of the 100 rupees that you had earned earlier. So how much do you have left? 40 bucks, right? And the share that you now had was not yours to begin with. So you give it back to the trader, to the broker that you took it from. So the broker gets his share back. You get 40 rupees as profit because you bought it, you sold it at 100 and you bought it back at 60. So the difference becomes your profit. And then that's basically how short selling works, that the difference between those two prices is your profit. So short selling happens a lot in the market right now, specifically for companies that are about to go under, specifically for companies that are failing, especially companies that have issues associated with them. Maybe exactly how, like say the exactly how the okay, something is wrong. Okay, exactly how it worked with the Adani report, Adani and the Hindenburg report, right? So Hindenburg report is an activist firm or an investment firm that actually it's like tanked his stock, and they earned an insane amount of profit by short selling the Adani stock because it fell massively when the report came out. So those are the ways these companies end up making money by short selling. One downside of short selling is just that what if the price does not drop? The price keeps on increasing, but you have to pay to give the broker his share back, right? So this is basically an unlimited loss that you can take in short selling, considering the price of a stock can keep on increasing to infinity, which means that the potential for downside is also infinite as a consequence. Another thing that is discussed in debate sometimes in some motions is how a short squeeze works. So a short squeeze is that when a lot of people end up shorting a stock, and everyone wants to pull out their basically get the kind of profit that they want. What happens is everyone starts selling their stock as soon as also everyone starts like buying those stocks as soon as they feel the stock is going to go down. So everyone's like shorting the stock at the same time. But the law of demand kicks in, right? The more you demand an item, the higher the price of that item goes. So stock market also work on the same demand supply mechanism, which is I explained earlier. So what happens is when everyone starts demanding a stock, everyone wants that kind of stock, the prices actually keep on increasing instead of dropping. So everyone has to just like starts to sell the stock as soon as they enter like a loss situation, because the prices have increased so much as a consequence of increased demand. So those things are interlinked, right? The short squeeze basically just involves that a lot of people lose out on their money as a consequence of their own demand created a problem, which is basically the price have increased as a consequence of that demand. That's how a short squeeze works. I would really suggest you read about that a little more in detail. But just for the basic debating purpose, this is how a short selling works. You change the difference. The difference becomes your profit for the kind of action that you take. Cool. Any questions on this before we get forward? Okay. Okay. Sorry. All right. Additional concepts then. Stock market. This is a great tool. This is a great way to run the accountability mechanism. So a lot of teams are able to explain that when a company will do X over Y, then their image suffers. When their image suffers, they obviously their stock prices fall down, similar to what happened with Facebook when Cambridge Analytica's report came out, what happened to Adani when the Hindenburg report came out, or what happened to basically Nvidia when DeepSeek came out, right? A lot of money gets wiped out from your MCAP, but also the kind of stock prices that you have as a consequence of there's some negative PR that you get. So it's great to run the negative accountability mechanism here, that if you do something that's bad, your stock market prices will fall. That means the amount of money that you earn will also fall. The company suffers because market confidence is what drives prices up or down within the stock market. Again, it goes under demand it goes out of demand law, right? If more people want this thing, only the prices increases. Then if people do not want this thing, the prices fall down massively. So no one wants to no one wants to associate with like a company that has negative PR, and that's why they're likely to. That's why companies like to take action that do not piss these people off, or do not get like fall into the negative PR thing, because that's going to hurt the stock prices that they have. The second thing about stock market is also IPOs. IPOs are initial public offerings, which means a company that was privately held now goes public, which means they give out a percentage of their shares to people, or retail investors and institutional investors. And it's good because it creates more money for these companies. It's a great way to earn more money as opposed to relying on just loans from banks. So IPOs are great because it gives you more money, but it's also bad because things like transparency harm a company's ability to take decisions on their own. So if a company goes public, then obviously everything about your company in terms of research, in terms of financial reports, something that you have to keep on like releasing every quarter, but also that the people who now get on board on the board of directors or whatever, the people who own your shares, those people do get a voting power in the way a company goes ahead and makes decisions, which means that it does make the company more accountable in a good way, but it also reduces the company's ability to take decisions unilaterally. And in some instances, specifically true for tech companies, they have to take unilateral decisions because the market does not truly understand why they're taking a particular decision. So what happens is that in a dynamic competitive world, companies need to make some changes that are radical, but people don't understand how those radical changes work out. So they usually end up voting no for that particular change, or their confidence in the market reduces as a consequence, and that severely harms a company's ability to take that decision, even if that decision is exceptionally crucial for them. So IPOs can be good, or going public can be good because it gives you more transparency as an average consumer, but can also be bad for the company and their long term plans as a consequence. So IPOs can be like defended or like beaten down on either side. Does someone have a question? Yes, Priyansh.
Just on this, I don't. Well, if there's IPO, why is it bad for transparency? Because I think if a company is going public, they will try to get majority of the shares with them or with their institution investors. But probably towards the public, they may own like very small shares. So like if I own Tata share, it's like 0.005%.
Yeah. So you can't stop like the decision, but what you can do is that if the market confidence falls in your company, then people like to sell your stock much more. So what happens as a consequence is that your stock prices fall because you have gone public. If you're a private company, that decision has no ramification beyond like people getting pissed off, but they can't really do anything about it. But here, people will get pissed off and they will basically start selling your stock. That becomes a problem. So you might not directly have power in the way the voting works out, because obviously, like retail investors just make 3 to 5% of the entire market. Retail investors are just like people like you and me. It's mostly institutional investors who invest a lot in these kind of companies. But the idea is that it can become bad in terms of how people start selling your stocks and stock prices fall down. So it's bad indirectly. Whereas on the comparative, if it's a privately held company, there is nothing that a company that people can basically do beyond like call them out. But the call out doesn't really work or do anything. Yes, Shashwat.
Yeah, on the first point, I wanted to ask what are the negative impacts of a company's share falling down in the short run? So a news came out and suddenly, for example, Adani shares fell down in the short run due to Hindenburg. But why would a company care about that? Because in the long run, we know Adani is doing great right now. So like what are the negative incentives for the company in the short run? That's what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, like the amount of so if a lot of people start selling your shares and your prices fall down massively, then the amount of resource that you have as companies also reduces massively, which means there are two parts to this. The first part is just to say that companies get less resources to do things like innovation, hire more people, do expansion. But it's also about the fact that there are other competitors in the market. So if they start selling stock for one company, they end up buying stock from a competitor, and that means that you suffer in the long term as well. So because the other person gets traction because they have not done the same bad thing as you have done. So it works hand in hand at that point.
Yes. I had a follow up on that. Unless a company is doing an IPO, anyways, these are not primary shares to begin with. So if I'm buying a share of any stock, let's say I'm buying the share of Adani is not getting the money. I am buying it from another person who is having that share, who is selling in the market. So these are secondary shares that I'm trading. So in the short run, if secondary share market, if the prices fall down, anyways, it's not going
Yeah,
out
in
from the
that extreme,
company.
in that short run, it doesn't change. Yes, because obviously the secondary market doesn't impact the primary share, or the person who has initially held the share from the primary market. It doesn't impact them directly in the very short run, surely. But obviously, like, it's about the median timeline that you take in the way of how the mechanism is going to flow about. Because then you can just explain, if nothing works out, then you can just explain that in the very short run, if public confidence goes down, people just stop engaging with the company as a consequence. Which is that you stop buying Adani, say cement, if you feel that Adani is a company that's not going to invest heavily on its innovation as a consequence of them suffering in the stock market. So those are things that you still have to account for. In the very short run, it will not work. Like, say, not in the next 1 month, but it will work over a course of a year when people have to buy more stock from the company. Yes, Rishabh.
Yeah, so I have a question. Ki companies have many more channels to get money, like we are venture capitalists. So practically in a debate, how are we going to weigh for this particular comparative between, say, IPO and a venture capitalist, or let's say other channels of getting some sort of investment?
Yeah. I think you have to analyze what kind of investments you're able to get. So venture capitalists usually invest in like ideas and people. They invest in companies that do not have the best business plan, but these companies show a lot of potential. So venture capitalists do have a lot of disposable income to give to these companies, and they see a potential return coming out of it. IPOs, regular people like you and me can subscribe to IPOs, which is very different from how, like, we cannot do a venture capital fund, right? But we can do an IPO. So again, to analyze what kind of investment you get, banks expect like collateral. They expect you to give like a fixed rate of return. Venture capitalists usually get like a larger voting share, but banks do not get that voting share when it comes to decision making. So like those are differences, right? What kind of investor invests in, what is the nature of that investment, and what they're expecting out of that investment. Regular people like you and me invest in IPOs just for like getting stock because it's a good form of investment, but we don't expect to actually run the company or like do voting or get like dividends. We do expect some dividends, but we don't expect like a surety or dividends, because we're just doing it so that we can utilize our money in a form of investment. Okay. Moving to bonds then. Bonds are basically guarantees that the central bank or any private or even private or government actors can go ahead and issue. The reason you raise bonds is for things like quantitative easing purposes and controlling the money supply. What this means is that if you sell bonds in the market, that like we'll give you say 7% over a course of 10 years. That's the way the promise works. So once you give out that promise, you take money away from market, right? So if the market has a lot of money and you are in a situation where people are spending a lot more, and you want to take that money away from people because you believe that spending more can lead to things like inflation, and you want to control that, you end up issuing a lot more bonds as governments to take money away from the market. And when that happens, people's disposable income reduces, and that means they have less money to now spend on other goods, right? Other things. That's one way to just control inflation. But if you believe that the market does not have a lot of money and it needs more money, it needs an injection, then you end up selling those kind of bonds, and that means you end up buying those bonds back as governments, so that the money just goes back to people. So it's just like, if you want to infuse liquidity into the market, or you want to take liquidity away from the market, on the basis of that, either you buy or you sell as a consequence. Bonds are also great for governments because they can raise a lot of money in the short term using this. So governments usually rely on things like debt from IMF or World Bank or whatever, but they also rely on things like taxes to go ahead and fund their coffers, the exchequer specifically. But bonds are a great way to get money in the short run as well. So if people have money, banks, they can just buy a government bond, and governments use this money for things like welfare schemes or infra projects, which means that they don't have to rely on things like taxes or debt, which are much more complicated ways to get money. Those are also viable alternatives, but bonds is also an alternative that governments usually end up opting into. Protectionism. Protectionism is good for self-reliance, but it's exclusionary, which means that your ability to rely on other actors within the supply chain reduces massively, which means the supply chain has to be localized within your own economy. If shocks happen and it happens throughout the country, then you don't have any check back against that, considering you have closed your economy to external actors. But that means it's good for great for self-reliance because you don't have things like predatory practices like dumping, which usually end up happening if foreign actors enter your economy. But it's great. So it's great for those kind of things. Great for protecting local businesses, but it's just bad for people going ahead. It's just bad for self-reliance. It'd be bad for like things like supply shocks that usually end up happening. So it's essential for trade, essential for economic shocks, but there's lesser trade as a consequence of protectionism because you're, like I said, more self-reliant. What is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage, I think I mentioned this briefly earlier, is basically that if a country holds some amount of uh, good or resource or any sort of industry where in a large scale, which brings a lot of money to them, that becomes a comparative advantage. So Bangladesh has a comparative advantage on textile because it has like fertile land which is ripe for those kind of that kind of production of things like textile, whatever is used in textile, cotton and stuff like that, cotton, jute and all those kind of things. So Bangladesh comparative advantage is textile. Similarly, a lot of countries have their own comparative advantage, like Saudi or like Middle Eastern countries. Their comparative advantage is oil because a lot of oil is found within those kind of countries. Similarly, China has a comparative advantage over silicon because the world's 80% silicon is in China. So those things are great because you can rely on these things like at any point to increase the amount of trade that you do, increase the amount of money that you earn from those selling those things. But sometimes it leads to things like over reliance, which is bad because it ends up restricting ability to diversify your economy. So if suddenly the supply of oil reduces in the world because people want to move green, then Saudi has basically no recourse, right? So over reliance on this particular industry is bad for those countries, but it's good to earn a lot of money in the short term. So just like how comparative advantage works generally. What are economic shocks? Again, this can be ranged from anything from like say like purely economic shock in terms of recession that happened in 2008, the housing crisis, bubbles bursting, or it can be caused due to externalities like COVID or like say a disaster and stuff like that. Economic shock usually end up stopping or halting economies, but a stimulus is then required to restart those economies, similar to how a lot of countries gave huge scale packages to people as well as to businesses to ensure that they start spending more, consuming more, and they don't just like stop those kind of activities because those are things that run the economy. And laws are usually relaxed. These laws can look from anything from labor laws to environment regulations to licensing deals that you give out easily to companies so that they are incentivized to start investing and keep the economy running. Dumping as a concept is like cheap goods. It means that cheap goods are sold at less prices than domestic prices. So China dumps a lot of goods in smaller economies, in economies that are weaker, underdeveloping and developing nations, because they are able to produce those goods on scale and they invest. They throw these goods in those countries, and these goods are usually not top quality. These are usually cheap quality, but this is good because cheap quality goods usually are sold at cheaper rates, which means that this is great for those domestic markets as well. But the flip side of this is that it harms those domestic markets, considering people are not able to produce at the same rates as the kind of imports that they are having from China. So this harms local production, but it increases consumerism greatly. So it's again a balance between the two, or how much dumping is good, how much dumping is bad. Then lastly, supply chains. Do you have local and global supply chains? So there are two facets to any supply chain debate. You talk about how it impacts local supply chains and how it impacts global supply chains. So this can look like even things like outsourcing for that matter. So this looks like business process outsourcing. A lot of countries usually outsource a lot of like Western companies usually outsource their call centers to India because India has a lot of people who can, you know, you can get employed in those call centers, considering those are not very high paying jobs, but also they employ a lot of people at one point. So supply chains are diversified across the world. Some countries want to localize them. Some companies are okay with like diversifying them across multiple countries. So that's how the supply chain also works out. Again, something very very common idea in debates. Then again, a common idea that we're going to see. Oh yes, go ahead, Tanya.
Sir, can you please explain the outsourcing again?
Sorry.
Can you please explain outsourcing again?
Oh, outsourcing. Outsourcing is basically business process outsourcing, wherein you outsource as a company. So you have multiple parts to like the vertical that you have, right? As a company, you have manufacturing, you have then marketing. It first starts from like just sourcing of raw materials. So sourcing of raw materials, manufacturing, then selling, and then there are ancillary ideas to this, which is like marketing, after sales market, and all those kind of things. So you have multiple facets to a company, and they usually end up outsourcing some part of it to other countries, wherein they believe that they will incur lesser cost to do these things. So, like one example, like I just used right now, is that a lot of companies in the Western world, they have their call centers in India. So Indians are the ones usually running those call centers for like customer service, because it just costs lesser to hire like an Indian as opposed to hiring an American for the same process. And that's outsourcing. It reduces your cost massively. This can also look like in any other sector that you can do, right? You can outsource the kind of production that you have, or the one part of manufacturing, and then you can take the good back because you believe the other country manufactures it at a lower rate. So this outsourcing is basically you putting one part of that supply chain outside because it costs lesser, and then you utilize it back in your own country. Yes, Rishabh.
So let's assume a motion, and the context explicitly states that motion is set up in a country where a pandemic is going on. So, to what extent can we credit this fact or argument that since the world has been through COVID-19 pandemic, so the particular government of that country must be knowing how to handle these kinds of crises, and maybe economy won't be
Rishabh,
going
you
that
cut out
down.
for me.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah. The government of that country must be.
Since the world has been through COVID-19 pandemic, so what's the extent the government of that particular country must be knowing how to deal with such kind of crisis, and economy won't be going that down.
I don't truly understand your question. Like, the government does not know how to handle the COVID-19 crisis. What about it?
No, basically I'm asking since the world has been through COVID-19 pandemic, so government must be knowing what to do, when this kind of crisis again hits back. So to what extent can we credit this government will be knowing economy उतनी नीचे नहीं जाएगी जितना पहले गई थी?
Yeah. So governments do end up. So this is obviously like a question more specific to situations. So I would say that some countries are well prepared for things like crisis to happen, specifically those countries that usually go through a lot of crisis. So if a country goes through has like, I don't know, not just COVID, but to be honest, it's multiple things. Right, if a country is disaster prone, then they obviously prepare for those things from the get go. But if things like COVID happen, it's unpredictable, and most countries have not prepared for it. Then it probably is going to teach them a lesson once. But like, it doesn't mean that even after 50 years they will still be at the same preparedness level. So countries do get complacent considering how political scenarios keep on shifting, and your economic condition is not always great, which means that they can't always prioritize things like protection of economy as a consequence. But yeah, in the short run, maybe like all countries in the world right now are better prepared for handling another like wave of COVID or whatever, because they know these are kind of investments they're likely to make. These are kind of, so that's why like there's a rise in like protectionism right now, if you notice, as a consequence of how COVID has worked, and countries just believe that shutting down of the global supply chain is going to hurt small countries much more, and everyone wants to localize everything so that they are not reliant on other actors. So that's how like the protectionism is also a good thing. Yes, Radhika.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
So, would you mind explaining the B part of the dumping section once again?
What part? Sorry.
The second part of dumping. What do you have written on the slide? The second.
The dumping is a predatory practice because you give cheap quality goods, but so you enter a market. It's a predatory practice because it predates, like it basically takes away the ability for domestic players to compete with you, and that's why it's bad for smaller companies or local companies. But it's great for consumerism because if the goods are cheap, then people can buy it. So domestic companies probably produce at higher rates, and that means the prices are also higher.
Could you just repeat this dumping once again, like the brief, what exactly it is?
So dumping is that countries which can produce cheap goods. Say, let's say, I'll give you an example here. Like say shoes, right? A company in China, or like China can produce shoes at much lesser cost than say an Indian shoe brand, for example. Because China has that kind of production capacity, they already have like sweatshops and all those kind of things that are present, which means the cost of production in China is much lesser than cost of production in India. What China does is that it sends a lot of these Chinese made in China shoes to India and into Indian markets. And if a consumer goes to the market and he sees a Chinese shoe which costs like 100 rupees and an Indian shoe which costs 500 rupees because the cost of production in India is higher, then they're obviously like to buy the Chinese good, right? Because it costs lesser. So consumers work on that short term idea. Even if the quality is much lesser, but they still end up buying it because it costs 1/5 of the price. So people are like, I'll just buy this shoe. Maybe it won't last as long as like an Indian shoe. But what I'll do is after every 2 months, I'll keep on buying the same shoe at 100 rupees. So that's how it works.
And this practice what China does is the predatory practice, right?
Yes, because it reduces the ability for Indian brand to sell, but also that means that it harms their ability to sustain into the future. So if you can't sell, obviously you can't sustain.
Got it. Thank you.
Ayushi?
Yeah, so the question is, in outsourcing, is it necessary that one company does it only for reducing the cost? In an example, if in my proximity the quality of anything is not good, a company might outsource it even at the higher cost. So, like, is it justified?
Yeah, absolutely, it's justified. So they don't just do it for costs, but they also do it sometimes for diversification to prevent things like supply shocks from harming them. So if you're outsourcing your say call centers for India, even if it costs more, for example, let's take your case. Even if it costs more, the idea is that maybe like in a hypothetical world, Indians are just more educated or they know how to handle these problems much better. If it's a tech product, for example, so Indians can handle it better than say American counterparts. So even if it costs more, they're okay with the trade-off because it one helps them get better quality, or sometimes it's just better because for example, if COVID is happening, like it's an epidemic example, there's an epidemic in America, and India is not facing that disease or epidemic right now, then obviously Americans can't go to the call centers, but Indians can go to the call centers. So it's a trade-off that they're willing to make because it also causes diversification, which means you're not reliant on your own country or your own localized market from start to finish vertical, right? So you can diversify those things because it helps you like make you more resilient against things like shocks or crisis. So those are also valid concerns that companies have when they end up outsourcing. Usually it happens through sales. Usually it happens through the cost saving method, but there are other incentives also which are equally good.
Yeah, fair. Thank you.
Okay. Right, I'll move on to the incentivized currencies. This is a very common debate that happens. This house regrets the creation of euro. This house believes that the world should have one currency. This house believes that Middle East should have a common currency. This house believes that South Asian countries should make a common currency. So exactly how euro works. Euro is good because it eases financial trading. Companies can set across borders with less risks and less exchange cost. So what this means is that if you're stealing the same money, it doesn't matter in which country you set up, right? The monetary bit reduces, the incentive of monetary bit reduces, but there are other factors that you can now focus more on. So availability of labor, for example, or tax laws, or maybe just the licensing deals that you have. But the money, this has not become a deterrence now. The kind of currency exchange that it doesn't become a deterrence now because you can move easily across borders or move easily across the zone in which this money operates or this common currency operates. This is just more stable because if the pool of money is larger, then there's less volatility, and if there's less volatility, then investors are incentivized to invest in your economy because they believe that they'll get a solid rate of return as a consequence of this currency just being more stable in and of itself. Because obviously, if you invest in an unstable currency, there's a good chance that you might end up losing a large chunk of your money. So more stability is just good. The pool of money is larger because obviously there are now 15 countries using the same kind of currency as opposed to like this one country in isolation using their own currency. This also incentivizes big states to care about the well-being of smaller states. So The West and East Europe currently do not have the same kind of economies. The Western Europe countries are just much more stronger in economy. So France, Germany control the maximum amount of how Europe policies on the euro work. But that doesn't mean the smaller countries that are also reliant on euro do not have an equal say. They do have an equal say, but the problem is that their economies are very different from the economies of the Western European countries. They are more export oriented or more in the tertiary sector as opposed to Eastern European countries that are usually in the primary sector and are more import oriented. So what this means is that if you have a common currency, then the Western countries are also like basically responsible for what happens in those small countries. So they are more incentivized to give them loans, help them out with technology, help them out with trade, so that at least those economies don't suffer, because economic loss or shock in that country is going to hurt the larger power as well, or the Western power as well. So this democratizes the risk across the spectrum, and that's why it's good as a centralized currency, so that it ensures that small countries do get benefited by larger countries who usually would not have any other incentive to help them out. But the mere fact of common currency is what forces them to help you out. Yes, Shashwat.
But if the bigger states have the majority of the centralized currency, that also means that they only have the control over how much they can fluctuate the prices, like majorly. So the 2007 crisis happened because something happened in the US, but something like that is very less likely to happen in the smaller states. Smaller state crisis happens, which usually happens in developing countries.
But the idea is that if Germany wants to say devalue its currency or devalue the euro, they can't unilaterally do that anymore, right? So maybe it's good for Germany because it would increase the amount of exports it does if it's an export-oriented economy. But they now can't do it because if that happens, then the ability for people in the Eastern European nations to import goods reduces as a consequence of the devalued currency. So that's where they have to toe the tricky line of how much they can basically influence the currency policy, because it also affects the other countries that are reliant on them. So if that country ends up suffering, if a smaller country ends up suffering, that also hurts the way the investor confidence works within the German market, or just like the confidence of euro just falls down. So they have to toe that tricky line, and that's just good because it diversifies the risk. On the comparative, if you did not have euro, they can devalue their currency and not care what happens to the other economies around them. So this forces them to care to an extent. If not completely, this is like a added incentive for them to care. Okay. Yes, Angita.
Could you just explain briefly again how centralized currency causes brain drain? I didn't catch that.
I did not get into the bad.
Okay. Oh, so sorry.
Right. It's bad because it's hard to implement protectionist measures, like I was explaining on the example of Germany. If so Germany wants to devalue its currency, they cannot now do it unilaterally. They need to. That means that it becomes difficult for them to enact monetary policies according to their own will, and that's something that is now controlled by the other actors also within the same region. But a lot of these countries have to make concessions in order to join the common currency area. So there is something called the Maastricht criteria. I'm going to drop it on the chat. I'm going to drop the spelling. It's MAAS something. Yeah, it's the Maastricht criteria that a lot of countries have to meet in order for them to join the Eurozone specifically. This is also true for any other common currency you can think of, that they need to make certain concessions about their own policy making, and also need to reduce the amount of protectionism they have in terms of policy making, so that they can open up their economy or their monetary, basically the monetary policies, to the rest of the people within the rest of the countries within that same zone. And that's how they're able to opt in, which means that their ability to unilaterally take decisions for themselves. Yes, the Maastricht criteria. That's the right spelling. So they have to basically meet this criteria before they're able to enter the Eurozone, and that's good because that forces them to basically align themselves with the rest of their neighbors. But it's also bad because it takes away their ability to take decisions unilaterally, or the autonomy decisions reduces. Then, yes, Gopal.
For this idea on the first aspect as to why this is good, can OP say that this isn't good? This is happening not because of Eurozone existing, but because EU exists, right? Because of a lot of things that exist. I think currently.
Yeah. So it works hand in hand, right? You don't just make just make monetary policies based on the amount of money you have. There are obviously other factors like political factors, or how many people are moving between your countries as a consequence of eurozone. So if it's EU, then obviously there are other factors that make up EU, that people can move between countries because of the Schengen area, right? But there's also like the fiscal policies that they make as a consequence of being within the same like European Union. So those things are work hand in hand with this. Like you don't make a budget by not accounting for the political scenario, the realities of like the social realities, the political realities. Those do work hand in hand. So you can explain that this is not happening because of eurozone. It can also happen because of EU. That's equally valid. But I'm talking about specifically how this can be played out within a debate. If you just had to debate whether common currency is good or bad. Okay. Brain drain. Yes. So the reason why brain drain is mentioned here is that if I know that I'll probably have, so the purchasing, so the way is that if I know that I can earn more in another country, this is maybe like I can, if the purchasing power of this country is lesser and the job is equally paying, so the purchasing power parity in this country is lesser and the job is equally paid, then I'll probably want to shift to that country as a consequence. So the example of this is that, for example, you get like a job of an analyst in Germany, but also the same job you get maybe say in Czech Republic. Obviously, the cost of living in Germany is higher, but if the salaries are equal as a consequence of you earning in euros, or the company just gives you the same amount of money because they don't have to do that conversion anymore, then you're likely to just shift to Czech Republic. This is good for small countries as a consequence, but it's also equally bad for Germany. So brain drain can happen due to the same reason as why you would want to shift to another country to earn more there. Obviously, accounting for the purchasing power parity that you have or the difference that you have, that is still different. The PPP is still different across these countries. But if you're earning in euros, you can spend lesser there and still be like saving a lot of money as a consequence of you not spending more. So that's why brain drain can happen. It's okay. I don't know. I don't think the sentence is complete here on hard to compete. Okay, just move to the next one. Yeah, but it's bad because it cannot adapt the strength of a currency to suit your market. Yeah, exactly what I was trying to explain earlier. That if Germany wants to change its monetary policy, if they want to devalue its currency, it cannot do it anymore. Unilaterally, it has to take into account everyone else. So yeah, same example applies here. Okay, the way to win economics debates then. And this is again very counterintuitive, but a very solid way to win economics debate is to actually debate politics. The reason why politics works great is that most economic impacts tend to become political impacts at some point. So if you look at protectionism, this is an example of why protectionism is good, right? You have tax revenue, you protect domestic industries, you start developing your own economies of scale. It's better for workers because you can get them state subsidies. You can incentivize domestic markets and all those kind of things. This really helps the government a lot. Someone unmuted? No. Okay. So this really helps the government a lot, right? Directly, because you become politically popular if you are ensuring that people or like small local companies are protected, but also local subsidies are given a lot more. So it just helps the government a lot more, which means that it's great for government image building. So the motion is that this house, as the Indian government, should opt for a protectionist regime or whatever. So those kind of motions can be impacted by explaining how it just helps the political scenario of the country. There's lesser unrest, there's lesser unemployment, or maybe like businesses grow, which means governments collect more taxes directly. Those kind of things, right? So politics is a great way to impact economic debates, because the impacts of economics usually doesn't always flow out to the people very directly. Even if it does, then the way they retaliate to that change or that impact is through political voting or the political mechanisms. So that's why politics is a great way to go about economics debates. I'll give an example here that I think I've like used a couple of times before. So there was a motion, I think, in Vitark 2023, which talked about farmer subsidies. And my opening government explained why giving subsidies is great for, and it was like this house as Indian government would give subsidy or something. So my opening government explained that giving subsidies is going to help these people earn more money, which is good. or like I think it was opening opposition or something. Yeah. So the opening just explained how this is great for the economy, right? You send out, you are able to produce more, and that's why you are able to export more. When you export more, the economy gets benefited because you guys just have increased GDP numbers and all those kind of things. But at closing, what we did is that we said that this is great to prevent things like social unrest, because the farmers' protest was going on at that time, in 23 or just like right around about that time. So we said that it is great to ensure that people or farmers, which constitute a large portion of the population of the country, do not end up protesting. That's why you should give them subsidies. So economic impacts like increased GDP can happen due to multiple other factors. It's not just reliant on agriculture, and that means that this impact just becomes more, I would say, persuasive to buy, because has a tipping point for why this is like, it cause lesser unrest if you give them subsidies. But that impact is probably good enough, but it's still vague enough for us to completely buy why this impact happens uniquely as a consequence of this policy. So politics can be a great way to extend debates also, specifically when top half discusses mostly about the way money will flow. So it's a good way to extend also, but I would say that it's more realistic for most judges to buy political impacts as opposed to buying economic impacts, per se, or just as a consequence. Similarly, if you're talking about protectionism against, then governments usually end up picking bad industries when they're being protectionist. So this is a consequence of companies that are too big to fail. Things like lobbying and national pride or lack of knowledge means that the kind of comparative advantage you tap into when you being protectionist is not always guaranteed to be good, which means you can end up opting into bad industries as well, which probably are going to die out. So like Saudi would tap into the comparative advantage of oil because they believe it will give them maximum money, but maybe after 20 years it won't be sustainable at all. And that's the problem, because there's imperfect knowledge. What FDI does basically, or like anti-protectionism does, liberalization does, is that it involves other companies setting up various industries within the country, which is good for diversification. So that's the idea, that this is the flip of that idea. But there's also lack of incentive to compete now, which means that domestic companies, when they do not have to face competition from foreign actors or external companies, they end up usually, the incentive, it basically breeds complacency, right? It forces them to, it doesn't force them to innovate anymore. It doesn't force them to reduce prices anymore because the competition has gone down massively. So innovation suffers, competition can also suffer as a consequence, which is bad for product development or consumerism as a whole. The lesser FDI also means that there's lesser job creation, because small companies which are domestic companies cannot employ a large number of people on scale, whereas like a MNC can probably employ a large number of people, so it's just bad for job creation. And this also means that you have things like more expensive goods because there's no price competition that happens between any companies anymore, which means that this creates things like social unrest, and that is bad for the government as a whole. For the government, or just for like social fabric, right? You don't have to impact specifically on the government. You can impact it wherever you want. But the idea is the political impact is just more easy or more intuitive for the judges to understand, as opposed to an economic impact, which is sometimes can get tricky for you to navigate as a judge of why this economic impact matters more than the other economic impact, specifically when you don't show or visualize how it plays out within the world. And that's why politics impacts are great. Yes, there are three other additional things that you should keep into account when you are dealing with economics debates. You should always be clear on what the stakeholder is, and how to weigh that stakeholder specifically. Obviously, you can weigh out middle class people the most because they're maximum in number, and poor people are the most vulnerable. So you can weigh them out very well. But there are also, like I said, other actors on why those are important. So maybe why small businesses, the local businesses are important, because they create some level of, they are more in line with what people would want them to do, as opposed to an MNC which does not listen to people at all. So things like environment, if that matters more, then small startups are probably more in line with how they should form their supply chains, which are more like, which harm the environment less, but larger companies want to harm them more. So those are kind of impacts that you need to draw out, explain why those matters more. One stakeholder matters more than the other. Like the counter way to explain why poor people do not matter is just to explain that poor people do not even have access to education to get employed in an MNC. So even if you're going to give them jobs, they don't have the capacity to get into those jobs. So even if one side benefits poor people, it probably don't get, or like says that poor people are, or says that, on op you have poor people getting harmed, and op can symmetrically claim that they're going to get harmed on both sides. It's not going to change. So this is another way to just wash off this claim and explain why other actors also matter. So what's your stakeholder? How does stakeholder uniquely gets impacted as a consequence of this policy? So the things that you should be more focused on, and never get confused with spec mechanisms. It's just mostly going to be fancy demand and supply across, like, so stock market, public confidence going up, accountability. It's just like that the demand falls, and that's why the prices drop. Similarly, the public confidence increases, again, demand increases, prices go up. So it's mostly going to be the same demand supply issue that's going to exist in whatever kind of debates that you do. So if there's like a hedge fund which is going ahead and investing in a particular industry, then you can just talk about how that industry suffers. But the way this works is that if that industry ends up suffering, it's the consumers that end up suffering. So because they are the ones who have to now, their demand falls as a consequence of price increasing or whatever, as price decreasing, the demand goes up. So those are things that you just have to like think about. It's never the spec mechanisms that really win the debate. It's about how you're able to simplify them into the basic things that most people just know about. And lastly, always remember that governments have different budget for different things. So if someone says that government should not invest in infrastructure because this will take money away from healthcare, for example, it's true to an extent, but governments are not dumb enough to not allocate any money to healthcare. Obviously, there are different budgets that they have. So this is also true for like IR debates. I think there's a motion that India should invest aggressively in Southeast Asian countries, which has a strong presence of China. I think it was said last weekend. If that's true, then obviously a case could be made on up to that say that you should not lend to these countries because what about the money that's utilized for public healthcare education? But that's not always going to be the case, right? You have specifically demarcated budgets for different items, which means it's not always a very clear trade-off that you have to make. Even if there's some level of trade-off, it's not going to be as bad as the other side claims it to be. So those are things that you can always remember when you talk about different budgets and everything. Yeah, that's mostly it, I think, for the PPT. If you have any questions, please let me know. I think we ran for 1.5 or something, so. Any questions, anyone? Any motion you want to discuss that you recently went through and you couldn't wrap your head around it? Yes, Adamya.
Yeah, so like talking about inflation, like if you inject money into the economy, that would lead to inflation, and like as you make it, inflation also leads to like higher salaries, which means it's not that bad. But when hyperinflation happens, that's bad. So like where do you draw the line? Like when does inflation spiral down to hyperinflation? How do you make it?
I don't think you have to make it. This is like I said, the debating is not like you're not making actual policy, right? You don't have statistics and numbers to realize how these things play out. So it mostly just comes down to reasons that you give, and if those reasons are persuasive enough. So there's no line that I can tell you that okay, this inflation is okay, 2% is okay, but 4% is bad. I cannot do that for you. Like I said, it's not a policy that I'm making. It's just about reasoning that you give behind on why you should do something or the other. Yes, Aditi.
This was a motion at CBS only semifinals. I think you were capped there, right? And that motion was about arbitrage essentially. So I think these are like, how do you deal with motions that you really don't know anything about?
That's an interesting question. I would honestly like defer to the most basic answer to this is to just like read more, learn more, and maybe that would help. But I would say that sometimes like when motions like these come up, like say arbitrage, then obviously there's a clarification or a context that's given on how it works out, right? You buy from one market, you sell in another market, and that becomes the difference. So whatever the difference is, that becomes your profit. If that's the case, then you can just talk about how taking from like a market wherein the cost of good is lesser and selling to a market which the cost of good is higher is going to mean that this causes a disbalance in the way the supply chain can work. This can cause a disbalance in the way profits are earned within this market, or all those kind of things. So obviously, this is not going to be super clear, but I would say that reading more about this is the best way to go about it, unless you can find out something from the context side which helps you make one example which you can use to argue that motion. So yeah, spec motions are just spec motions at some point, and I think debating just, I would say the reasons just end up failing if the other team has a lot of spec on it. But like I said earlier, it's not always going to be that other team's going to convince the judge because they have more spec, right? Judges also have to understand it. So simplification is also good, but I think reading is good enough for you to understand what you have to simplify first. If you do not know or if you do not have background knowledge, then you probably can't simplify anything. So yeah, I would resort to the safe answer of saying that it's about reading more. This is also true for all IR debates, right? Like if it's about, say, Houthi rebels, then what can you do if you do not know who the Houthi rebels are? You're basically locked out. So that's why you have three motions in AP. You can veto out the one that's the most spec for you, I would say. Yes, Ishanvi.
Hi, is there any way to like argue against taxing the rich, i.e., like taxing perhaps the unrealized gains, or like just wealth tax in general? Because on the counter, it's very intuitive from like the government side to argue that okay, these people should be taxed like their unrealized gains and all of that. But how do you oppose this?
How do you oppose taxing the rich? It's very like hardcore right-wing capitalist argument that I have to think of now. I mean, the obvious answer to this is that, so obviously wealth tax is different from the tax that you take on their corporate earnings, right? So if the idea is that it's about corporate earnings, then obviously if you tax them more, then like you resort to the four sector model or three sector model, which says that their ability to innovate reduces, their ability to hire more people reduces. So wealth tax on individuals should exist. I don't think there's a good reason to say that why they should not exist. Maybe I mean most of these people don't anyway pay taxes. They usually park their money in offshore accounts or just like assets across, or they just take up more loans than they actually earn up money so that they don't have to pay taxes. But I would say if it's about corporate taxes specifically, then yeah, innovation, employment generation, market competition, all those things are the ways you impact and explain why increasing taxes is going to reduce the incentive or the ability to do those are the things which are probably more beneficial at some stage. So you can explain why innovation is good, or creating those economies of scale is good because it creates things like accessibility to the poorer section of society. That's why if you take more money from corporates, then their incentive to build additional factory or expand in say rural areas reduces. That's one way to go about it. But it's not about wealth tax. I think that really I hardly think of a good response to why wealth tax should not be taxed. I mean, it's just good because government just earn more money. So how do I explain why Elon Musk's private money matters more? Yes, Kanishka.
Okay, so I saw this motion recently that this house would impose GST on tobacco and alcohol. Gov could potentially argue as to how this would simplify the whole structure, would be a deterrence for the black market, etc. What could the op case be?
I should not have tax GST on tobacco and alcohol. Okay, that's yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think that there's an op in this debate, honestly. Like I can think of gov arguments which also talk about how this de-incentivizes consumption of these items, but no, I'm drawing a blank here. I actually do not know what the op is. Like if it's
okay,
same
no
as
worries.
if it's the same as VAT, then like if it's same as VAT, then I do not know. If it's the same level as VAT, then I do not know. Maybe
Okay.
incentivizing these things, I don't know. Like why would you want to incentivize these things? Like
Yeah, because we currently don't have GST on these things.
yeah, but you still pay. So that's exactly what, right? If Gov explains that this is a bad for for society because this consumption is harmful to health or whatever.
Gov has a clear case.
Yeah, I don't know what op case is. Because if op cases, even if op builds a case, why is it not symmetrically applicable to any other sort of good that you consume? Why is it just for tobacco and alcohol? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, no worries. Thank you.
I just had like question if op case could be run on like the idea that the black market eventually like benefits the governments at large because they're filling the government's coffers from maybe like a back end and stuff like that. Would that be like a
That's valid, but I think the black market argument isn't super convincing because sometimes black markets end up like costing a lot more than normal markets, which is because they are black markets are unregulated and everything. So like maybe you can run a case on why black market is inherently bad because you have bootleg alcohol, which is not super safe for people to consume, and maybe that can cause health hazards and stuff like that. So, sure, there's a case debate there, but I don't think it's super persuasive or not. Maybe there's a line, but I don't think that it's a winnable line. in my view. I might be biased about this motion also, so I don't know. But I could talk about how this leads to, I don't know, health hazards because people will end up going to black markets more. Okay, any more questions? All right. Yes.
Actually, I was doing this motion recently and I just went blank. Could I share that motion?
Sure. Okay, what's the motion? Yep. So, what side are you thinking of? Or what side do you think is tricky?
Gov for me.
Okay. So obviously this is bad. If you are opting your defensive measures, because you can talk about what kind of companies, specific kind of companies that end up suffering a lot more if they end up opting into things like poison pills, because then the decision making gets diluted massively. If you're issuing new shares and those shares have voting power associated with them, then what it means is that a lot of people who are absolute, I would say, randos, end up going ahead and buying into those shares. And if they end up buying into those shares, then the ability for like decision making reduces for the person. Or like if you had some vision, then obviously the board would vote some other way, then your decision basically gets screwed over massively, right? So it's bad for the kind of stakeholders that you have. So think about healthcare companies, for example. Healthcare companies, or maybe just like say news media outlets, like how NDTV tried to adopt another strategy that calls the crown jewel strategy as a defensive measure, which basically involves selling of or like giving away. Give me a second. Yeah, sorry. So there was another strategy that like I said, NDTV tried to opt into, but there are so many strategies, and what it does is it harms the eventual stakeholders of that company, or the people, the consumers basically. So you can talk about how this strategy is going to get utilized in the worst kind of ways, and when that happens, then the consumers of this particular that company end up suffering. So it's better to just have a hostile takeover, because at least it ensures continuity, or at least a unilateral decision making power that this new whoever is taking over has. So they at least have some incentive to ensure that the company maintains its consumers or continues to grow or whatever. But on the flip side, if you dilute your shares, it is going to be bad, because now everyone has a piece of the cake which they do not have any knowledge about. Similarly, I think you can apply it to the staggered board as well. So if you have multiple people, different people serving different lengths of tenure on the board, then obviously decision making gets hampered because less continuity, specifically impacted in those companies which require a continuity in the decision making that they have. So technology companies, for example, all those things. I mean, I would just say on op, the best way is to just explain that defensive measures are a company's right to opt into, specifically when companies get acquired through hostile takeovers, because hostile takeovers basically means that the company's autonomy is snatched away from them, considering how you buy. The person who's buying or doing the hostile takeover ends up buying someone else's share, which the company had no control over because it's in the secondary, it's a secondary share, and that means that they have no control now to basically have the autonomy of decision making. You can also talk about how this de-incentivizing hostile takeovers. I think hostile takeovers can be bad because the kind of people who do hostile takeovers usually do it with an agenda. So if Adani took over NDTV, he probably thought of I don't know, controlling the narrative of the news or somehow. So maybe you can analyze those kind of incentives of why those incentives are bad and why you should have the ability to do self-defense in that manner. So that's just good, because it again can be impacted on the kind of stakeholders you have, right? So if NDTV is not as, like, say, fair in the reporting anymore as a consequence of this takeover, then it's just bad for the people who consume news. So that's also like a way to just approach it, of how self-defense is important for continuity. So one is from a management point of view, the other is from like a self-defense point of view. I hope that was answering. Yeah, okay. Cool. So we're going to close the session now. If you have further questions or anything else that you want to discuss, any motion specifically, then you can always feel free to hit me up on WhatsApp. I'm sure you can take my number from the group. And yeah.